VeggieTales! Okay, how was that for an opening for a video? As some of you longtime Media Mementos fans may know, I used to be a VeggieTales YouTuber from 2015 to 2019. And that's why I have this Bob the Tomato pin here on my avatar. It's a nice little reminder of what used to be. Because I stopped making those videos, there were a lot of VeggieTales related ideas I had that never really got to come out. But now I finally get to show one of them off for you right now thanks to our Patreon raffle winner, Kev Messick. Thank you very much, Kev. I hope you like it. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Where's God When I'm Scared? Where's God When I'm Scared from here on out for simplicity's sake?
What are you gonna do?
I'm going to call the police.
This was the first episode of VeggieTales ever, and the production history? Oh boy, it was a wild ride. So let's get ready to learn all about the complete history of Where's God When I'm Scared. VeggieTales was the brainchild of a man by the name of Phil Vischer, who when he was a kid realized his calling from God. He was watching videos on MTV, most specifically ones made by Madonna, and realized just how much, in his own words, filthy content was out there on TV. He remembered what Fred Rogers said, that he would make his show what he thought TV should be like, so Phil Vischer decided to do the same, but with a twist. Much like Mr. Rogers, Phil Vischer is a devout Christian, but unlike Mr. Rogers, he was going to produce something that was all about growing faith. Of course, he wasn't going to do that right now. He had college to go to, and then drop out of. After a while, he got some jobs in a production house duplicating VHS tapes, but his dream of making a helpful and wholesome Christian show never went away. In order to start pursuing his own ventures, Vischer left the production company he was working for to form his own, GraphX. Get it? Graphics? Yeah. Here he would do some freelance work for advertising and low-budget local shows, and while this was able to put a little bit of money on the table, it wasn't the fulfilling experience that Phil Vischer wanted. After a little while, Vischer partnered with Mike Naraki, a college friend of his who had the same ambitions, and they worked on a new show that would take the Christian world by storm, and that show was The Phil and Mike Show. Bet you thought I was gonna say VeggieTales there. Nope, that's later on. The Phil and Mike Show was designed to be a teen-focused series where Phil and Mike would discuss problems that they'd face in their everyday lives. This wasn't an animated series, and it wasn't considered a main draw for GraphX either. Instead, this was seen as a bit of a warm-up act when it came to them developing Christian entertainment. They pitched the show around to a couple people, and they all came back with the same response. You know this isn't gonna sell, right? The problem that Vischer and Naraki learned about was that it wouldn't be Christian teenagers who tend to buy Christian entertainment, it would be Christian mothers. So designing a show for kids rather than teenagers would be where the real money would be made, and hey, if you get the kids started while they're young, they'll grow up to be strong and devoted Christians. With this idea firmly in place, Vischer and Naraki began to throw around ideas. While Vischer was working on some advertising jobs and trying to feed his new family, he came across something revolutionary, a commercial about moving salt and pepper shakers that adored a toaster oven. Yeah, it's not exactly groundbreaking cinema or anything, but this commercial used a technique that Phil Vischer became enamored by, and little did he know, would change his life forever. The technique of squash and stretch. Vischer notes in his autobiography, Me, Myself, and Bob, that many computer animated projects at the time, even with big name ones like Pixar, had rigid and stiff models for characters, but this commercial had fluid movement that helped the characters feel alive. Vischer did some looking around and found that the Canadian animation company Softimage would be able to help him fulfill his squash and stretch dreams. Once he got Softimage installed, it was on to designing the characters. As Vischer was designing his first character, which was a little ball with an even littler face, he realized that one of the big problems with this whole squash and stretch thing was that it couldn't do things like hair or limbs. So his characters had to have none of that. He first designed a chocolate bar, but his wife protested, saying that moms wouldn't like it if he made kids fall in love with a candy bar as a main character. So thinking with a healthy point of view, much like the healthy band from Don't Hug Me I'm Scared, Phil Vischer settled on, what else? A goofy but happy cucumber. This cucumber was named Mr. Cuke for the time, and he started in his own little demo called Mr. Cuke Screen Test. This began to grow the seed of what would become VeggieTales later on. From here, Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki would feverishly discuss the plans for what they wanted the show to be, which would amount to being telling Bible stories to Christian children, as well as several pop culture references and well-written gags to make the older audience laugh as well. With this plan, as well as Mr. Cuke's screen test, the two would go to production companies and pitch the show, now known as VeggieTales, hoping to get some investment capital for this revolutionary new idea. This big idea, if you will, which would shortly become what Graphics was renamed to because, well, Graphics isn't exactly a fun name for kids, but Big Idea most certainly is. However, during each of these pitch meetings, they were always met with the same response. This sounds like a cool idea, so if you make it, we'll be happy to sell it for you. And no money came of this whatsoever. The two decided to make an even bigger pitch called Take 38 in 1992, and the same thing happened. Everyone was interested in selling the show, but they weren't interested in helping make it. At this point, Phil Vischer knew that if VeggieTales was going to be made, he and Mike Naraki had to do it themselves. More specifically, it was up to Phil Vischer to take a brunt of the work. What he did was he went to a production company that he used to work for and said, "I'll work for you, but only if I get to work on this pet project of mine in my spare time." Luckily, a deal was met, and Phil Vischer was pulled out of his very scary financial troubles. But even though he had a job to help keep himself and his family vaguely afloat, he didn't have enough money to invest in the new show. That is, until a man who he went to church with donated $80,000 to him, no strings attached. According to this generous donor, the project was too important to go unproduced. Speaking of funding, Vischer also managed to get some from his mom and his stepdad, and that was pretty impressive because, all things considered, they hated to spend money, but they wanted this crazy VeggieTales thing to be produced. However, before Vischer got the money, his mom had 3 conditions that she wanted him to agree to before he made the show. Firstly, Jesus could never be portrayed as a vegetable, which essentially meant that they couldn't do any New Testament stories without changing a lot of elements. Secondly, the show was never to state or imply that the characters themselves had any relationship with God. Vegetables don't have souls after all. The only exception would be if the characters were playing somebody in the Bible. And the third and final rule was that at the end of every episode of the show, the characters had to remind the kids that, in some way, shape, or form, God made them special and he loves them very much. Phil Vischer agreed to all 3 of these rules, so the deal was met. Oh, and the show also got some funding from a billionaire Cypresian media mogul, but he didn't have all that much impact when it came to dictating the course of the show, so moving on. With capital in hand, Phil Vischer, Lisa Vischer, and Mike Naraki were able to come up with new ideas for what should be in the first episode of VeggieTales. There'd be times where the Vischers were doing their own thing and then all of a sudden, a song would pop in their heads, and they liked it so much that they had to keep humming it again and again to make sure they didn't lose it. Then once they got home, they wrote it down so it could be preserved forever. Specifically, these songs would be the Water Buffalo song and the What Did We Learn song, the latter of which would be seen in most episodes of VeggieTales going forward. Not only were the songs starting to materialize, but the characters were as well. Mr. Cuke, now renamed Larry the Cucumber, and his straight man friend Bob the Tomato were going to be accompanied by Archibald Asparagus, the stuffy and uptight member of the team who wants everything to be refined and sophisticated, Junior Asparagus and his family, a surrogate for the audience and their family members so that the show could portray facts of life and parts of growing up, and 3 rapscallion scallions who were always up to no good. These characters would be starring in 3 overall segments. The first would be Tales from the Crisper, which would serve to tell kids that they don't have to be afraid of monsters under the bed or scary movies because no matter what they're afraid of, God is always bigger. The Water Buffalo song would come right after that and would be their take on Monty Python's And Now for Something Completely Different. Finally, there would be Daniel and the Lion's Den. Having just seen Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Phil Vischer wanted to do something like this to kick VeggieTales off, albeit on a bit of a smaller scale. Once it came time to put this whole thing together, Phil Vischer came to a startling realization. Animation is hard. He can't do this himself. Not only did he bring Mike Naraki to come help him, as well as 2 newcomers, Chris Olsen and Robert Ellis. The Vischers also brought on their church's worship leader Kurt Heineke to do the music. The first episode of VeggieTales, Where's God When I'm Scared, started off being animated in Phil Vischer's apartment, but after space became tight and Lisa Vischer became uncomfortable, they moved everything to an office complex in downtown Chicago, albeit not by themselves. They were sharing the space with a young upstart artist artist who was trying to make a comic book. And by the way, this guy turned out to not be the best office mate. He stopped paying his heating bill, and don't forget, this was winter in Chicago. Everybody was freezing. But that didn't matter because they had an episode to complete, and now they had a firm time limit too. Whether this was the best idea or not, I can't really say, but Phil Vischer started putting teaser ads in Christian magazines letting people know that VeggieTales was on the way. Later on, he would also put in a number for pre-orders, and as soon as he did, it became crunch time. They had a Christmas deadline, and all of this started in October. Keep in mind, this is back when CG animation was in its infancy, so it wasn't as easy to pull off as it is now. Not that animation's easy, I'm just saying, now there's a whole bunch of independent stuff out there and you can take classes online. Back then, that wasn't the case. 4 guys in some office in Chicago had 3 months to tread uncharted waters. And if they didn't, they'd be out a lot of money and potentially go to jail. Not helping was that the software they were using wasn't really up to the task. It didn't have enough space to carry all the frames for Where's God When I'm Scared. So what they would do is take 39 frames at a time, put them on a tape, back it up, wipe everything, get 39 more frames, and repeat over and over again until everything was off. And if that wasn't bad enough, they got constant phone calls taking them away from their work. They set up an office line for inquiries and pre-orders like I mentioned, but they didn't have anybody else to answer the phones but themselves. So this would constantly happen and take them away from their work, all while they were wasting precious moments. And then, just as things looked like they were finally about to go their way, they lost all of their hardware. They were renting what they were using, so when time ran out, they had nothing left to do. Phil and his crew took all the data off the rented machines just in time, and then borrowed machines from the production company that Phil used to work for, and that Mike was still working for, and just barely met the deadline for getting this thing out the door. As soon as the film was rendered, Mike Naraki put in the sound effects and leveled the audio, and the moment he was done, they rushed the master tape off to the duplicators, and then got some much-deserved rest. They'd been pulled in consecutive all-nighters to get this thing done, after all. And wouldn't you know it, the investment did not pay off. Only about 500 copies sold at first, and sales didn't improve for quite a while. In fact, Big Idea Productions as a whole wasn't profitable until about 5 years later. And then they got too big and fell apart, but that's a story I've already covered here, and it's this video by the way, in case you want to check it out. Once VeggieTales became a big hit, and then even later when it became mainstream, Where's God When I'm Scared, despite being a bit clunky and weirdly animated at times, would be seen as a true classic. It's hard to find anybody who doesn't at least appreciate what this thing has done. It started a generational show that's still beloved by people to this day, even though the company's in limbo and is, let's face it, probably not going to do anything noteworthy for quite some time. There was only one negative fallout from Where's God When I'm Scared though, and funny enough, the person to point this out was none other than Phil Vischer himself. See, going back to when he was first getting the idea to do something like this in the first place, he wanted to create the anti-Madonna in a sense, something wholesome that was able to teach people about the Word of God. Well, it was wholesome alright, but according to Phil Vischer, it didn't do its job in terms of bringing Christianity to young kids. Oh yeah, it mentioned God a whole bunch and it talked about morality, but I think this quote from Phil Vischer says it best. I launched Bob and Larry back in 1993 and personally oversaw each video release and product until 2003, when a lawsuit forced the company into bankruptcy and out of my hands. God turned what seemed like a tumultuous loss into a huge blessing, as I was given time and space to get off the VeggieTales treadmill and just focus on Him. As my relationship with God grew deeper and my love for the Bible increased, a profound thought hit me. Had I just spent 10 years trying to get kids to behave Christianly without actually teaching them Christianity? I love VeggieTales and everything, but yeah, he's kinda right. And unfortunately, that had a negative ripple effect with other shows as well. Most specifically, things like Bible Man, who thought that they could be VeggieTales, but weren't exactly talented enough to get that thought into reality. And it goes on to this very very day. It wasn't a problem with VeggieTales per se, but other shows like the aforementioned Bible Man, or even things that Big Idea would make themselves like 3-2-1 Penguins, had bland, superficial lessons that didn't further the message of God. But that's a story for another day. That, my friends, is the history of Where's God When I'm Scared, a mad dash to meet the Christmas demand, all while being an upstart company story, a conquering adversity story, and a story of togetherness all in one. What else could you expect from something like VeggieTales? Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What was your favorite part of this story? And hey, what's your favorite episode of VeggieTales if you've seen it? To this day, my favorite's still Lyle the Kindly Viking, but there's some stiff competition out there. Although I will admit that I don't watch VeggieTales nearly as much as I did back in my heyday, mostly because that experience kind of soured me from being a regular viewer. As I've said many times, I still love the show, but I can never get as hooked on it as I used to be, and also, to be honest, I'm kind of fine with not being a VeggieTales YouTuber. The rule for Media Mementos at first was that no VeggieTales content would be on here whatsoever, but I loved the show too much to stay away. But now I only do it sporadically so I don't fall into that same trap again, where I became known for VeggieTales only, and then when I tried to do new things, it just wouldn't land. That's another reason why you've been seeing less moral oral stuff, you know? Anyways, comment below, let me know, because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon people, starting with our Masters of Fate. Chan 11, Drew the Stew, Kev Messick, MD the Dude, Platinum Bass, Quiet Chap, Ryan Williams, Timey, and Woody Woo. And now it's time to thank our executive producers, Aaron Vasquez, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, HR Hoffman, Indiscreet One, Orsinus, Ravioli Supremo, Unkale, and who else but Zane. If you two would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then please consider donating to the Patreon. There's a link in the description below for you to check out. And we've also got a link to the Media Mementos Discord server right under that. So stop on by and say hello. Alright folks, thanks for watching the video and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!